Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this until very recently a very bad day with rain. I understand that there are a couple of other events happening right now, so we truly appreciate the fact that you are here and not there. That's big. And I'm sure that you're not going to regret showing up tonight, because we are having a very, very special guest this evening, a dear friend of mine for many years, Zach Karabell, from New York, prolific writer and public intellectual, not a publicist, which I mistakenly put down on X earlier today. He is the founder of the Progress Network at New America, which is a platform dedicated to cultivating constructive dialogue about a future. So that's the main reason why Zach is here with us, also to do with the fact that he kindly agreed to be one of the authors in the latest issue of our journal, Horizons, which had the future of Europe as its main topic. Zach has taught at some very prominent schools and universities, including Harvard and Dartmouth College, having himself obtained degrees from Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard. And he is, as I said, a prolific writer. He's author of 14 books spanning various topics, just like his career spanned various things. In investment and finance, technology, history, as well as international affairs. He was one of the very early American investors in China, which is an interesting thing that we're going to touch upon during the course of our conversation. But he is a frequent commentator for publications like the Time magazine, the New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Horizons. He appears on TV very often. And he's the host of the podcast, What Could Go Right? An overall highly optimistic figure. Also an author of a very interesting column of Substack, which is called The Edgy Optimist, which I wholeheartedly recommend to you to follow. So he is, as one can tell from his background, very optimistic person in general, very optimistic about the future, and he is for the very first time in Serbia, so I would like you to greet him with a great round of applause. So, Zach, we feel very privileged to have you with us, and especially as an author of Horizons, an author in the issue on the future of Europe. And I'm sure you had a chance to get a little look into the magazine. We had some other very prominent authors, most of which were very concerned about a future of Europe. Not terribly optimistic, in other words, about a future of Europe. Yet your article was exceptionally optimistic, because you are an arch-optimist. So my first question is, with the abundance of concerns that we're hearing about Europe, including from Europe, including in the Horizons, what makes you so optimistic about Europe? Is it some strategic trend that most of the others are failing to see, or is it just that you are an optimist by construction?
So thank you, and thank you all for coming. So first, a note about optimism. I think many people define optimism as the belief that the future will be better, as opposed to pessimism, which is the opposite, that the future will be worse. My version of optimism is simply that we have no idea what the future will be, and that the certainty that we think we know what the future will be is a problem, and that often pessimism is the certainty that we think we know that the outcome of the present is going to be negative in the future. And just as a general statement, that's clearly not true. You know, if you look at prognostications of the future in the past, they are usually, if not always, wrong. So think about what many people believed at this point in 2020, 5 years ago. Had we been here, we probably couldn't have been here at this point in 2020, given various government lockdowns and restrictions on whether or not you could be in public. And throughout much of the world, there was an assumption that COVID would change everything. It would change work, it would change global commerce, it would change travel, much of it for the worse. But really, there was a belief that it was a before and after moment and that everything would be different, right? I mean, I think that's accurate. And it is clear today that that was completely wrong. I mean, whatever else happened, COVID did not change the world in the sense of travel and work and social life and families and international trade and commerce. So that's just one recent example of be really careful when you think you know the future. And I'm just saying this by way of prelude, that my optimism is not, I think things are great and will be even better. It's that, one, we are in a cultural moment in everywhere in the world right now, maybe not in the UAE and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but most places in the world are relatively pessimistic about the present and the future. So whether it's Belgrade, Boston, or Beijing, or Bombay, I guess we can't say Bombay anymore, it's Mumbai, but you get the alliteration, that everyone thinks the future is going to be worse. And, you know, that's an assumption that means that people are not adequately considering the possibility that the fears that we have, or the concerns that we have, or the problems that we have in the present may not turn out nearly as negatively as we think. And that we are overemphasizing the possibility of Armageddon, and we are underestimating the possibility of utopia, if you want to talk about those two things. So, the point about Europe is, almost everywhere you go in Europe, or in the case of the Balkans, you know, countries that are part of Europe but not in the European Union, there is a pall of negativity. Europe is weak, it's disorganized, it's disunified. The EU is vaguely a monetary union that can't even function as a monetary union because there's no economic rules that are binding. It's a political union that can barely function as a political union because 27 member states can never agree on anything, and then when they do agree on something, every state then just pursues its own policy regardless of what Brussels says, right? So Hungary does what it wants, and Poland does what it wants, and France and Spain and Italy and Germany do what they want. And that it's has been dependent on the United States and not spent enough money and not spent enough defense money, and the vaunted transition to a green revolution is fading because now that there's no longer Russian natural gas, Germany has to burn coal or get liquefied natural gas from the United States, and it's an aging population, and the social safety net isn't working, and there's not enough investment in healthcare, and everybody doesn't like each other, and the Americans are leaving.
But that's all true, right?
Right, well, that is all one way of looking at it, and that's familiar, right? Everything I just said, everyone's like, yeah, what's your point? But the flip side is, it's a 27-member state economic union, which is the largest attempt of nationalities to work together in a cohesive fashion, except for Brexit, which I think came as a surprise to the English and the British as well as to the rest of the world. It's a union that has not only stayed stable, but may expand. It may include Moldova, it may include other countries. It's 450 million people with an aggregate per capita income that is, other than the United States, the single most affluent group of nations in the world. And yes, there's a difference between per capita income in Bulgaria and per capita income in France, but in general, it is an incredibly affluent set of nations that, if you just take a step back for one moment, would have been the dream of almost every human being living on the planet for all of human history, right? If you had said, one day there will be this kind of affluence and stability, right? There's not been a war within Europe since 1945. And I know you'll say, well, what about Ukraine, right?
In other words,
That's barely within Europe. I mean, you have to really stretch the boundaries. And is it scary? Is it threatening? Sure. But there has not been, I mean, Europe fought I mean, you all know this. I'm not going to lecture you about European history, but, you know, Europe fought itself for ever, 1,000 years. Peace, stability, and prosperity with a certain amount of economic and political unity, which doesn't mean there isn't disunity, and an immense capacity to change course, you know, defense spending, more economic reforms, you name it. And I think all of that is augurs very well for the present and the future, as opposed to this constant hand-wringing that we're all falling apart and the future is grim and glum, period.
so you do think that in the future there can be a Europe that acts as a cohesive bloc on the international scene, because we live in increasingly geopolitical, if you will, times, and the big actors like US and China and Russia and others are using increasingly their clout in the geopolitical realm, the pre-1945, if you will, type of attitude towards global affairs. And obviously the EU not being united fully finds itself stumbling on the international scene when it comes to common foreign policy.
Sure.
So do you think that part of the future in Europe could be more unity, in a sense that it does act as a united actor, you know, on these scene of giants, if you will?
So I would say united-ish, meaning it will never be as cohesive as China as an actor in foreign policy. Mm-hmm. It will not be as cohesive as the United States. It does not have a unitary EU sovereign government in Brussels that is the equivalent of the sovereign government in Moscow, in Beijing, in Washington. That's absolutely true. But the EU does act cohesively, right? It's not as if the EU is split on its policies about Ukraine. It is largely unified. Now, it may be split in how it does it and what it does and what it approaches. And while it's true the EU lacks the cohesive military force of the United States or of Beijing, it's equally true that Russia is far less powerful as a military than, you know, certainly than people thought before February of 2022. Look, I mean, the reality is, if Russia were so powerful militarily, the Ukraine war would be done. And that's what everyone thought. Everyone thought Russia would march on to Kiev, and 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 days later, I mean, I think the Russians, you know, they brought dress uniforms with them along the road into Kiev, and that didn't happen. And 3 years later, they've taken the Donbass, and everybody's entrenched. But, you know, they're not nearly as strong as Russia thought they were. And while it's true that much of Europe is, I guess, concerned about the prospect of Russia's military, and if you're Finland or Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia or Poland or Moldova, maybe you are more concerned, as you have been for most of known history, right? Those groups have been concerned about Russia. It does. No one seems to be answering the logical question of what are the actual limits to Russian military power, and it seems pretty limited. You know, I think it's a stretch to think that Russia is nearly the kind of threat that Putin wants people to see, or that many Europeans are reacting to. So, you know, even there, it doesn't have to be a cohesive bloc. It's not going to compete with Beijing in East Asia, but nor should it or need to. It's not going to compete with the United States as a global military force, and the United States is clearly no longer hegemonic the way it was, even though it retains the largest traditional military. And as the Ukraine war has shown in the face of drone warfare, it may not matter whether you have a massive military if you have really good drone capacity in the world coming. So, you know, even there, it's a matter of taking that step back and realizing if you're Congo, you have real problems, right? If you're Syria, you have real problems. If you're Myanmar, you have real problems. I don't know that the problems of the European Union are anywhere near as problematic as those places, and yet you wouldn't know that given how people talk about the world.
So let me push back on Russia a little bit, because I actually agree with you when you say that the Russian military power proved to be probably less than what it was thought in before the war started. The latest stage of the war started in February 22. But you wouldn't get this impression if you're listening to European leaders at the European Council. And everybody's talking about massive ramping up of military spending. And Germany is going to do the rearmament again for the first time after 1945. And the French speak about increase in defense spending. And of course, Donald Trump wants the European allies to increase their defense spending. So Russia currently is fighting a war. It has about 6% of the GDP sliced for defense. And that is considered to be a war economy. And actually, one of the reasons why the Russian economy has not melted under the pressure of sanctions is partially because there are people in the world who still want to buy Russian oil, but also some changes in Russia amounting to a setting up of a war economy, increased defense spending, that has a effect of a boost, at least like a short-term boost to one's economy. It is in force. So the Europeans are now talking about the increasing of defense spending to 5% of their GDP. That's close to 6%. And actually much more money, because the European economy is much bigger than the Russian economy.
Yeah, I mean, just to interrupt you there, 5% of European GDP would be larger than Russia's entire GDP.
Sure. So, but we're talking about the war economies. War economy in Russia, and if this succeeds, a war economy in Europe, and we're talking about the two entities that have a very, very difficult political relation. So two war economies next to each other in history. So I'd ask you normally what can go wrong, but since you're an optimist, I'm going to ask you what can go right under such circumstances.
So look, we're all products of and burdened by whatever history we choose to remember as important to our lessons in the present. And so when you talk about European nations arming in anticipation of a potential conflict, it's hard not to start thinking about 1913, 1914, where everybody is building up armies in anticipation of a conflict while also being economically very integrated. Right? So the high point of European economic integration is August of 1914, right? And then that is also the beginning of the great conflict. That's certainly true. It also matters what the quantities are. So, if you look at a proportional arms buildup and troop buildup, building rail lines, troops in 1914 amounted to millions of men in the armies, hundreds of thousands of miles of rail lines, and massive armaments. First of all, you don't need that level of troops anymore because we have much more destructive weapons than howitzers and machine guns. Sometimes it's true that being heavily armed leads to greater risk of conflict. But if you look at the legacy of the Cold War, being heavily armed probably was why there was less conflict directly between the United States and the Soviet Union, and why there's unlikely to be direct contact between the United States and China. Meaning, it is because they are so heavily armed and because they are both so capable of doing immense damage that they are less likely to fight. Again, I don't know. I absolutely respect the fact that the fact of being heavily armed in anticipation of a conflict increases the possibility that something will go badly relative to its absence. Except for the fact that you could say the fact that Putin had not been challenged in Crimea, in the Donbass, in Georgia by the West. I'm not saying whether he should have been or not. I'm just saying he wasn't. You could argue that it was the absence of that that led to the conflict, and the presence of that would have changed it. And even so, it is likely European nations will rearm somewhat, but it is also likely they will remain disorganized, disunified, not interoperable, and will have less of an incentive to fight. They just think it will give Putin or whoever is ruling Russia less of an incentive to use those arms.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Got it. So let me then switch to another field, the field that you're much more familiar with, which is technology. And everybody talks about, European shaky competitiveness, especially when it comes to technology, when it comes to the top tier technology in particular, and AI is an example, but also the green technologies, the green sustainable transition technologies. Europe remains, very vigorous when it comes to its sustainability goals. The switch to the electric vehicles and the way you're going to power your economies, going out of coal, not using fossil fuels anymore. But the truth is that in those technologies, you have a global champion, an undisputable global champion, which is China. And if you try to compare Chinese technology and the European technology, Chinese is obviously superior. And especially when it comes to electric vehicles and electric batteries, there's no discussion whatsoever. Now, did the United States, at least verbally, I heard it from the president last week in New York, he talked about con job, the climate change being a con job, essentially moving away from the idea of sustainability. So obviously the United States does not seem to be a partner in the future endeavor of sustainability. Do you think that Europe can stick to its goals of the green transition without actually considering a much more comprehensive and close relationship with China that the United States of America would like it to happen?
So look, even under Biden, with the bizarrely named Anti-Inflation Act, which was really a green energy bill, the United States always had an ambivalent relationship to the same climate goals that the Europeans did. I mean, we're kind of never really honoring the Paris Accords in public policy, never fully comfortable with the rigor of those goals. So while there was the beginnings of a lot of investment, some sponsored by government in green energy and green technologies, which the Trump administration has definitely pared back, it was only a year of any level of that kind of commitment. And you still have huge contracts and state commitments, and the rhetoric of Washington, which is highly, highly hostile to wind, solar, renewables, doesn't mean that none of that investment is happening, right? It just means that Washington is not going to lead the way in it. There's still a huge amount of state activity in the United States, whether it's California, whether it's New York State, even Texas, which is the dominant wind power state in the United States, regardless of the fact that Trump doesn't like the way wind turbines look. So he's been very negative about wind turbines. He feels they're aesthetically unpleasant and that they shouldn't exist because of that. And the United States for a little while was trying to make countries choose. Right? You either have to buy Ericsson and Apple, or you can buy Huawei and Xiaomi, but you have to pick. And most countries, including European countries, said, well, we're not going to make that choice. And if you force us to make that choice, in many cases, we'll pick China, because Chinese equipment is cheaper and equally effective. And so that game seems to have stopped for now, and seems to have stopped. So the Trump administration really began this when it tried to do this whole global destruction of Huawei. major effort within the government, within the Trump administration, that was then continued by Biden. Biden did exactly the same thing. And the result was what? It just made Huawei stronger. And now you have, the United States won't buy BYD cars because, we prefer Teslas, even though Teslas get 350 miles for the most range of a Tesla, maybe close to 400 if you're lucky. If BYD is 600 miles, and all these cars are more. So, China is much more of a leader in green technology. And the United States, I suppose one of the things that's notable about Trump is that the Trump administration is simultaneously deeply hostile to the green revolution, but not nearly as interested in forcing or trying to pressure countries to pick economic sides between China and the United States. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see what happens between China and U.S. because I think most people around the Trump administration believe very strongly that Trump really wants to make a big, grand deal with Xi, which likely, the loser in that is likely to be Taiwan. But the winner is going to be, everyone who wants to buy stuff from China, because I think, Trump's attitude is going to be buy what you want.
But it's not just the American angle to it. Let me make it more practical. You basically want to switch to electric vehicles in Germany by 2040, right? It was 2035, now it's 2040. Essentially, you cannot make the BMWs and the Audis that are green, you cannot make them competitive in comparison to the BYDs and the Cherries and the others. So the question is, what is Europe going to do when it comes to cars? Are they going to allow Chinese imports, which would essentially lead to factory shutdowns in France and Germany and Italy, or they are going to allow the Chinese cars to be made in Europe under some kind of a deal that essentially deepens significantly the EU-China cooperation. In other words, what is, in your view, the future of EU-China cooperation, especially when it comes to sustainable technologies?
So, look, this is a really interesting question for the next 15 years. And, I had hoped in the things that I wrote and as an advocate over, let's say, 2012 to 2020, 2022, I was a failed voice saying we should not turn China into an economic enemy. And then that argument clearly failed, right? There were just too many people who wanted to decouple from China, fight a Cold War with China, and then Xi Jinping gave everyone who believed that a lot of ammunition to believe in that view. Even with all of that, it's extraordinary how little actual decoupling there is with China. Now, there's not nearly as much foreign investment in China, European investment, much less American investment. So that part has definitely changed dramatically. But in terms of actual trade and commerce, that has changed very, very little because too much of the global system is embedded in China's supply chains. And while that may change in 10 or 15 years, it's not clear that it can. I mean, the United States wants to, but we can hardly build a factory. The Chinese announced they're going to build they're going to build a factory in upstate New York, and they're going to build a factory in Wisconsin, and Taiwan Semiconductor is going to build a factory in Arizona. And it takes 2 years just for a permit hearing, and by that time, they've built 4 factories in India. So I don't know, how that's going to change. You're right that the prospect of all these cars coming in or Chinese manufacturing of BYD or Chery in Europe means that it will eventually erode Fiat and Peugeot and Audi and BMW. But as long as those factories, even if they're owned by the Chinese, employ workers, this is happening in the United States. All these, Volvo's going to make hybrid cars in South Carolina because, it suits their purposes. So I think the worker issue is less important, because all these countries really care about is whether their workers will be employed. It doesn't ultimately matter whether they're employed by Peugeot or BYD if they're employed. So I think you're going to have, as you said, more Chinese production. Some workers, they're not going to bring in Chinese workers. And that means this whole fiction of like decoupling from China, which everyone wants, including the Chinese, to some degree, they want all the benefits of selling and none of the costs. I think that's still much less easy to see, even with all the rhetoric being negative and even with all the desire in the world for everybody to magically say we're done.
So there's another big topic in Europe which is shaping the political debates, domestic political debates in countries, but also in the continent as a whole. And that is migration. Of course, it's a big topic in the United States as well, but it is a very big topic in Europe.
Yeah.
And one can actually say that 2015 and the big migrants crisis of 2015 was, in a way, a 9/11 moment for Europe, and lots of political developments emanated out of this crisis, and Brexit was one of them, but also the rise of political parties throughout the continent, which you would have never thought could stand a chance of winning an election, especially in major European countries. I mean, it's all related to that. So migration is a big topic. And how do you think this level of migration that we currently have is going to affect European societies? Because some of the authors in this issue of Horizons, including Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who wrote a piece for us, believes that this is a big problem. And so do the people in France and a lot of people in Germany. And in the UK, you have the Reform Party now leading the polls, and they talk about migration. So what is your take on migration and how, in Europe, and how much do you think this is going to be a problem for the future?
So somewhat like in the United States, we're sort of at a peak of anti-migration sentiment, the rise of populist anti-migration parties like AFD, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, like the Swedish right, Giorgia Meloni's coalition, the National Front in France. But most of that crisis is over, meaning the wave of migration 2015 to 2020 is not being met by a commensurate wave post-COVID. I mean, there is some migration, but it is far, far less.
In the UK, for instance, the number for last year was higher than ever, close to 1 million people coming to the UK.
But that was not true for Italy, it was not true for Spain, it's not true for Greece, it's not true for, transiting into Germany. So the UK is a somewhat different.
And that's why they're going to get a Reform Party.
Right, but I'm saying the problems of the UK are not the same as what's going on continentally, because a lot of these countries are preventing migration, and also with the end of the Syrian civil war and some degree of stability in that area, you're not getting nearly as many people leaving the region and heading into Europe. So I think you have to distinguish between the problems, anti-immigration sentiment in the US, anti-migrant sentiment in the UK, and migration sentiment in Europe. And those have clearly been, every country gets negative about immigration when a significant segment of the population is feeling economically precarious. So there's almost a direct, when people think things are great economically, they tend to allow for more migration and more immigration. When people are concerned about their economic prospects, particularly working class, they tend to get anti-immigration. And that's sort of typical. Whether one is causal or symptomatic, I don't quite know. I tend to think these things are symptomatic, not causal. Meaning, anti-immigration sentiment is a product of economic insecurity, perceived or real, rather than a cause of economic insecurity. Maybe, there's some argument that just the sheer volume of immigration 2015, 2016 into countries that were just not accustomed to that bulk of immigrants. You had 2 million Syrian and or other immigrants leaving in a very short amount of time to a very specific number of countries. A lot of that really went to Germany, and trickled up into Sweden at all. So that was destabilizing it was kind of a shock to the system because it was just so many people. But that's not what's going on at all now. So now you have like railing against the last war, as it were. And that will be effective, but it gets less effective when there are less bodies. Like even in the problem in the United States now is not that there are so many people coming into the United States. Illegal crossings in the United States have almost vanished. And that started a year ago, even under Biden. Now it's just, what do you do about people in the United States who are there undocumented? It's not migration. So I think we're way past peak migration, even if we're heading into peak anti-migration.
Well, that's very interesting. And we touched upon, European rival or enemy, the way that some Europeans are describing it, Russia and China, more as a rival than an enemy. But let's switch to allies. The most significant traditional ally of Europe has been America. So there have been some, fluctuations in the relationship and some interesting developments since the beginning of this administration, and most notably the tariff discussions, with the prelude related to political developments in Europe at the Munich Security Conference, or like Greenland, future of Greenland, and so on and so forth. But essentially, the biggest thing was the trade discussions, and the end of these discussions with the European-US deal that a lot of people believe was actually quite humiliating for Europe. So what is your view of how Europeans handled it? Was it a good deal for Europe, what they struck with Donald Trump? And what's your future projection of the US-Europe relationship?
So it's common now to say things like the trust that once existed between the United States and the EU, or existed between the United States and Canada, or between the United States and India, has been shattered because Donald Trump just woke up one morning and decided the tariff rate was going to be whatever number he said, and that was seen as deeply offensive and shocking by allies. A little like if you're walking down the street with a friend and you're, having a heated discussion about something, and your friend just turns around and slaps you in the face. You'd be shocked. And, you might not get over that. That's possible. At the same time, countries aren't like friends. Countries have to deal with each other, kind of whether they like each other or not. And I think one thing, if you step back, is the question of alliances exist for a purpose, right? They're not just, we're going to be friends as countries, and everything we do, we're going to do together. The entire system of alliances in the world today were a product of the Cold War. They were a product of, we share a common adversary, and in the face of that adversary, we will act together. The European Union is not an alliance, it's a union, maybe an incomplete union, but that's different. That's people saying, we are going to work together for everything. Not because we, have a common enemy, but because we see this as in our interest. We are clearly in a world where the alliances that framed the world from 1945 don't necessarily make any sense, right? They existed because they made some sense to a group of people. And part of what Trump is doing is kind of the Band-Aid ripping off of, if these don't have a purpose, why are they there? Now, you can make lots of arguments why they should be there, but essentially no one had made a new argument for why they should be there, right? And the problem with the tariff war is it is still more optics than reality. So no matter what the numbers that have been announced, the amount of tariffs that the United States is actually collecting is probably around 8 or 9% right now of what it's actually collecting, when you strip away all the exceptions. Because all that ever gets reported is the number. So Ursula von der Leyen, goes to Trump's tacky golf course at Turnberry, and Trump keeps her waiting, and she sits there, and he comes in and says whatever he says, and she agrees, and the entire presentation is, look how Trump humiliated the European Union. And maybe he was rude, and maybe he was humiliating, and all of that. But at the end of the day, there's also just the pragmatism of, do you want to deal with this guy or not deal with this guy? And all that Trump really cares about is, do you deal with him or don't deal with him? You mentioned Greenland. Like, Greenland was a huge deal in February. Oh my God, the United States is going to, go to war with Denmark? Invade Greenland? What are you going to do then? There are 50,000 people in Greenland. Is Denmark and the United States going to go to war? How many people have heard about Greenland in the past 6 months? Raise your hand. Right?
Many.
And I mean, that is the reality of the second season of the Trump show. So something that seemed really important. Right? I am sure Trump has forgotten about his meeting with Ursula von der Leyen. He's like, oh yeah, I met that woman? He's like, you met her at your golf course. He's like, oh, right, yeah. Did I? Yeah. Whatever. He's on to the next thing. And you don't even know what the tariff rates actually are, because none of this is in law. Little of it is in writing. Like, I don't even know what deal was struck. Do you know what deal was struck? The Europeans said they're going to invest, $500 billion in the United States? Mm-hmm.
Going to buy $700 billion worth of energy products.
Sure. So, someone wrote down, I, Ursula von der Leyen, agree to invest $500 billion and buy $700 billion. Do you think there's been any follow-up to that? Has it been staffed out? Is there a treaty? Is there a binding commitment? Nobody knows. I am sure there is no binding documents around this. Right? The Koreans say, we'll invest, I don't know, like some absurd number. Is anyone, there's no enforcement mechanism? There's no way of tracking this money? Like, nobody's in the Commerce Department going, Europe invested $10 billion last month, 12, you're under your quota. That's not even happening. So all this is bizarre in the sense of, it's reported as if it's real. Like, the only thing that's real is if you're an exporter to the United States and you're a European company, you need to know what the tariff rate's going to be in order to figure out what price you're going to sell that thing to the Americans for with that shipment. And that's all people are focusing on. How much am I going to pay when I get there? Or not even how much am I going to pay, how much are the company that's buying it going to pay when I get there? And if the aggregate rate's like 12%, who cares? I mean, who cares in the sense of, we could all say it's stupid, you could say it's brilliant, but it doesn't change global commerce overnight. It's not high enough, it's not effective enough, it's not collected enough. And so you're left with, has this done damage to the trust? Yeah, it's done damage to the trust. But it's all, for Trump, it's all transactional. And I think everybody is realizing the United States is no longer anything other than a very powerful country that's going to pursue its own interests.
Yeah, but what really did change as a result of that was the optics.
Sure.
And how it came across in the domestic publics in Europe and also around the world. That meeting with Ursula von der Leyen was very, very, difficult thing to forget how he treated her in the conversation. And then there was a follow-up meeting, not related to trade, but related to Ukraine after Alaska, wherein Putin and Trump had, spent some buddying time together. And then 6 European leaders were invited to the White House. Based on which criterion, nobody knows, so that the Finland was there and Spain was not, right, for instance?
Well, Spain was not because it has a socialist prime minister who says negative things about Trump.
About Trump.
Finland has a prime minister who likes to golf, and Trump thinks he has a good handicap.
So even with the bunch of Trump friends, it really did not look nice.
No, but
the way they were seated in the White House.
So that's an interesting example. The Europeans report on the optics, which is they're seated around the Oval Office. Trump's sitting there. They look. But what was the outcome of that meeting? Trump totally caved.
No, but the thing is that I'm talking about the perception outside Europe, outside the United States, perception of the world, Serbia included, global South, you name it. Like, oh my God. these people are treated like school kids.
Right.
So how are you going to value Europe if you're an outside country? If you're treated like that, if your biggest ally treats you like that, you are obviously weak. So that should, come into how we do business with you in the future.
But I think that was the wrong story. The story was Trump meets Putin in Alaska. Barely can resist giving him a big kiss, right, on the red carpet, and the planes, and then they go into the same car together, and 3 hours later they come out, and Putin is basically smiling, and Trump is like, I don't know what just happened, and then suddenly, there's going to be a direct peace negotiation between the United States and Russia. Maybe they'll invite Zelensky, maybe they won't. And the next thing you know, 6 European leaders fly to Washington, and the White House gets completely silent about dealing with Putin, about ending the war. And Trump turns around and suddenly is like saying good things about Zelensky. I mean, the reality is it worked. Whatever Putin had said and done that Trump was clearly enamored with in Alaska, he was
undone by the Europeans.
Was undone really quickly, really effectively. So the story.
I don't know if to cheer for this or not, because the war is still going.
All I'm saying
as a result of
is that the story should have been
that the Europeans managed to get their way.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, as a result of the fact that there are no talks and negotiations, people continue to die in Ukraine. And but we're not going to solve the future of Ukraine tonight in our conversation. Before pivoting to America, because this is a conversation in Europe, but I can't resist asking you questions about America. Before we pivot to America, who is, in your opinion, the strongest European leader today?
That's a very good question. I think Giorgia Meloni is the... Ooh, did I touch a nerve here? She has very effectively... being the Italian prime minister is a notoriously short-term job. And, she campaigned on a right-wing platform and has not governed that way. I mean, she's anti-migrant. She is socially very conservative and has very effectively kept Italy economically stable, a coalition government, and essentially has become one of the only voices that seems to be able to speak to Trump, speak to Putin, speak to Brussels. So, who else would one pick? I mean, certainly not the Germans, certainly not Macron. I mean, Macron is a lame duck, or is becoming a lame duck.
Not Starmer.
Certainly not Starmer. Certainly not. I can't forget the name of the Spanish prime minister.
Pedro Sanchez. But he's like a big survivor,
right,
politically speaking.
But you wouldn't say
he's the strongest leader,
right? Mitsotakis is very effective, but I wouldn't say he's
the strongest.
Yeah.
Well, great. I actually share your opinion. I would have answered in the same way. But now let's pivot to America, because of course it's really keeping everybody awake.
I'm very glad on behalf of my country to providing you with such constant entertainment.
It's never been, well, we had times when American action was more consequential in this part of the world, not in a positive way. But now the entertainment value is significant. And, but I don't want to ask about, the show. Some of the people that you and I know are deeply concerned about the future of America. And our common friend Ian Bremmer, for instance, believes that what's currently going on in America is like the third big revolution of our lifetime in terms of geopolitical consequences. That the first one was Gorbachev's failed political and economic attempt to change the Soviet Union. The second one was Chinese, actually, Deng Xiaoping's successful economic but not political revolution. And the third one is happening right now in the United States, that Donald Trump is actually a revolutionary who is trying to change forever the way that the United States works. And it's a funny thing that the same view of Ian Bremmer is held by Alexander Dugin. And, you know, Mr. Dugin and Mr. Bremmer are very different people with different worldviews, but he too believes that America is undergoing a revolution. So what is your thought? I mean, is it really going through the revolution in America? Whether is it going to be successful or not successful? Is it really going to change the way America works, what we currently have with Donald Trump?
So here again, nobody knows, which I know is unsatisfying as an answer. So I will tell you my opinion based on the fact that I also don't know. I think that Donald Trump, all the things that one thinks about Donald Trump, you know, that he admires Viktor Orban, that he admires Erdogan, that he kind of wishes he were Xi Jinping or wishes he were Putin. You know, I'm sure a lot of what he talked about with Putin in the car was like, man, I wish I could do that. No, seriously. I mean, I think there's a lot of like, oh, Vlad, you know, I wish I could arrest my opponent. I mean, he's trying. I mean, don't get me wrong. So the desire to be an autocrat or the desire to just have no controls is clear. The reality is it's much harder to do. And there is a large swath of people, particularly urban, educated elites, young people, progressives, you name it, in the United States, who fear that Trump is going to, with his cohort, create some form of American autocracy. And that is the concern, in addition to totally disrupting whatever global system existed. On the global score, I think much of what is happening was going to happen. It might have happened differently. It might have happened more quietly. It might have happened more politely. But the withdrawal of the United States from its position as an arbiter of a global system was really evident over the past 10 years regardless. And the attempt of the Biden administration to kind of magically return to, I don't know what, 1999, you know, as a, we're going to be the
Democracies versus autocracies.
and that the United States is going to be the kind of the protector of a rules-based global system. You know, just doesn't work, because if you're the Chinese or many other countries, you have gotten to the point where you believe that it's your rules system. It's not our rules system, and we don't really want to live entirely under your rules system. Yes, we want to benefit from you protecting some of the rules so that we don't have to. But the fact is, the more affluent and powerful multiple parts of the world become, the less willing they are to accept the United States as a hegemon that then breaks the rules whenever it wants. Because that's the reality, right? The United States, I mean, I was talking to I was in Kazakhstan in March, and I met with the Central Bank of Kazakhstan, the head of the central bank, and he said to me, you know, yeah, we liked the fact that the United States kept the rules even when it broke them, but we also like not being lectured to about how we should govern our own society, and if that's the trade-off, so be it. And I think that's true in a lot of the world, right? You don't, when things change, you don't know if they're going to change for the better or for the worse. But I'm saying, on the one hand, I think things were going to change regardless of Trump. And so to ascribe them to Trump, I think, is a mistake. There's a lot of systemic change in the world. There's a lot more nodes of affluence, and there's a lot more countries that are demanding to play a role in shaping their worlds, whether it's China, whether it's Modi in India, whether it's Lula in Brazil, you know, whether it's MBS, you know, in Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's a huge emergence of a new global power, or the European Union, or Putin, for that matter. I think one thing people forget in the United States, and I think Europeans also are beginning to forget, is how ugly and complicated a lot of American history has been. So Americans, I think, tell themselves a story of the great onward march of liberalism and freedom and progress, and then conveniently forget all the ways in which that hasn't been true in the United States. And we talk about, oh my God, Trump is going around the world and ruining the reputation of the US. The Vietnam War did not really endear the United States to large portions of the world from the late 60s into the mid-70s, including Watergate. The Iraq War did not endear people to the United States. And the fact that this is routinely forgotten, I find rather extraordinary. The United States has never been a place without domestic violence, without huge amounts of domestic unrest, and without governments attempting to silence speech, aggressively go after perceived domestic enemies. And so while all this is happening under Trump, it has happened again and again and again. I will admit that the Trump administration is full of angrier, more resentful people who have spent years building up their resentments and now have power and are determined to get back at their enemies, real or perceived. I don't think there's ever been an administration full of more pissed off people that I've ever seen. That's unique. They have power, and they're pissed off, and they're willing to use it. But the idea that the United States was this open, liberal, free place, and suddenly Trump comes along and we're about to become a dictatorship, I think is just ludicrous.
But one thing that I'm really worried about is polarization. And not just Charlie Kirk and the latest developments, but in general, I know a lot of people in America. And whilst a few years ago it was possible to have a common dinner party with people who are Democrats and the people who are not just Republicans, but pro-Trump Republicans, what I found this time around when I was in New York was that people wouldn't sit with each other at the same table. That has never happened to me before. So the trend of polarization and this hatred, and of course, this is not the first time in history. You're a country that had a civil war and the like. But do you see this cleavage being deepened and or not?
So much of that cleavage is specific to Trump. Now, it's also specific to policies of abortion, right? Hugely divisive problem in the United States where people who are deeply opposed to abortion would have a very hard time sitting at a dinner table with people who are in favor. So it's not just Trump. There's a whole series of social issues. I agree that polarization has become intense, and it suggests a level of internal conflict that will be a problem for the United States. Period. Underneath that, there is incredible consensus about democracy, free elections, free speech, capitalism. So 40% of Democrats, only 40% of Democrats say that they think capitalism is a good system. But when they say they like socialism, they basically mean they like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. They don't like socialism the way it looked in Europe. They like a notion of government spending more money for social safety nets, which is different than really being against capitalism, right? So it's not like people have very clear ideas about what these things are when they talk about it. So even with the polarization, there is immense consensus for government not being ever present in people's lives, for there being the freedom to choose your own job, move to your own place. I mean, those are real things that everyone agrees on. And because everyone agrees on them, no one argues about them.
And you only report the arguing part.
Right. So you're totally right that there is a degree of hatred and distrust that is not typical over our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. It's very typical over American history, not just the Civil War, but the 1890s, the Progressive Era. I mean, again, Americans routinely forget just how much they've hated each other historically. I mean, that's absolutely true. Catholics hate the Protestants, the Baptists hate the Southern Baptists hate the Northern Baptists, everybody hates the Jews, people hate the Black. I mean, it's Americans don't often like each other. We came out of a brief moment where there was an elite consensus. So you could go to New York and have a good dinner party. With
the Republicans and Democrats.
Right. But you still couldn't do that in 1960. a Southern Democrat and a Northern Democrat could not go to a nice dinner party in 1966 talk about race relations, right? So I think,
So it happened before, and it did not lead to a disaster. So you're saying, well, this is not necessarily going to end in a disaster.
I'm saying American history has been sufficiently bad and sufficiently ugly. So part of my optimism about the United States is predicated on a much more pessimistic reading of the American past, or in my view, a much more realistic reading of the American past. Which doesn't mean that you should be complacent, right? Because just because you got through something before doesn't mean you'll get through it again. But it absolutely means that I think the hysteria within the United States about our current moment is as much the problem as anything that's going on.
So my last question, and this is possibly the most difficult one, but I'm not going to press you with follow-up questions, but I'll ask you to be reasonably brief. Why did Donald Trump win not one, but 2 elections? The second one, from an impossible position, essentially staging the biggest political, or one of the biggest political comebacks in the history of democracy, defeating the establishment, if you will. Why was he successful twice?
So the first time, it could have gone, it was 50,000 votes, right? So it was a coin toss. Hillary Clinton was very unpopular, and many people felt like the system, whatever they thought the system was not adequately providing rewards. So he was a protest vote. Second time, he's not a protest vote in the same way, but he still is a protest vote in that, look, if people had not tried to imprison Donald Trump between 2021 and 2023, he would have faded from the news and no longer been as viable. I think Ron DeSantis said when the first indictment came from the New York State Attorney General to Trump in 2023, Ron DeSantis said, you just gave him the presidential nomination. And then, if it had not been Biden and Kamala Harris, maybe there would have been a stronger candidate. So Trump represents a powerful third of the United States, meaning, or maybe 30%. Same thing for AFD, a nationalist, nativist sentiment, of which there has always been 20 to 25% of the American electorate that voted for somebody, right? They voted for, a lot of those people voted for Clinton. Some of them have voted for Obama. You then have another 15% that just really don't like democratic policies. They don't like woke, they don't like progressives, they don't like government regulation, and they don't like Donald Trump. But you have 2 choices in the United States presidential system. You vote for this person or this person. So 15% of the people voted for Trump like this, right? I don't like this guy. I think he's terrible. I don't like the way he speaks. I don't like the way he thinks. But I like some of what he's going to do. And I think, unfortunately, the explanations for Trump aren't so deep. Everyone's trying to go, oh my God, what does this mean about America? What it means is, we're a rich, powerful country that has a lot of unsolved problems with a lot of angry people trying to have government either solve them or get out of the way of solving them, and nobody knows what to do. With a group of people in control who have a very clear set of resentments where they're trying to control everything, and time again, they're failing to. With another set of people who are completely hysterical about the attempt. And so I think the United States is going to be chaotic, noisy, very entertaining for the next years. Trump will provide an endless stream of new words to get obsessed about, right? He says the other day, we're going to send the army into Portland and have it use full force. And everybody reports this. Oh my God, he's going to send the military into Portland. What does he do? He sends 200 National Guard troops who are authorized to do nothing except stand there while everybody else yells at them. And that's what happens. And then the next story will be Memphis. The next story, it'll be something else a week from now. And we'll forget about
Greenland.
Yeah.
So my last round of questions are going to be actually very short. I'm not going to ask you to give your explanations, but I'm going to ask you to be long or to be short, to be optimistic or to be pessimistic on the following list of topics. And then I'm going to let the audience ask the questions. They may choose to ask you about this or not, or something else. But here are the list of topics, of subjects, if you will.
And I think optimism in this case is, do we think this is gonna do well for themselves? Right.
I think like an investor.
Right.
Are you going to buy or sell?
Right.
Are you going to be long or short?
Okay, fair. Just so we understand, this is the parameters of the lightning round that we're about to do.
Two-state solution.
Short.
The Republic of China, Taiwan.
Short.
J.D. Vance.
Long.
Peace in Ukraine.
Long-ish.
Green transition in the United States by 2040.
Short.
The United Nations.
Short.
Artificial general intelligence.
Long.
African Union.
Shortish.
Shortish.
Yeah.
Cryptocurrencies.
Long.
And last, Serbia.
I can't answer that.
So you just answered. No problem.
Relatively long.
Oh, great. Thank you for being diplomatic in your answers. And now I'm going to let the audience ask the questions. It's a free-for-all.
Actually, just on Serbia, I think it's a really good time to be a small country not clearly aligned with anybody. I mean that.
That's what I was like saying very, very loudly for a number of years before I stopped talking about Serbia. Sir.
Well, thanks a lot for...
You need to have a mic so that everybody can hear you.
I like your pocket square. It's very dashing.
Thank you. It's on sale. Srđan Garčić, thanks a lot for your time and a great presentation. But I think one question about your optimism is that currently, after maybe 40, 50 years of this like very liberal, progressive dream about, peace in the world, we are the world sort of ethos, now there's actually sort of, I would say, like a rival idea of what the world should be, which, some would say is nationalist, anti-migrant, more sort of entrenched. But I guess the people who believe in that think it's, more whatever, realistic, functional, alongside the sort of usual liberal optimism that we've all been sort of socialized into. How do you think that's going to pan out? Ultimately, one vision of the world will have to win, no?
You're totally right. And look, I was at Oxford at the time of 1989, and great example. Like, I knew all the people who started Fidesz. I didn't know Orbán, but I knew a lot of people around him. And they're all like, we're going to create this liberal, open society in Hungary after communism, and the EU forms in '92. And I believed all of it. I believed the world was on a path to more union and more prosperity. And a lot of that didn't happen, except for the fact that the world has absolutely been on a path to more prosperity. So I think that I don't know what the political organization is going to be, except for the fact that I think most of the nationalist rise is part of a global trend, and I've been saying this a lot over the past year, which is never have more people on the planet had their caloric needs met, physical security, some degree of individual freedoms, the ability to have their voice heard, and material affluence, and never have more people been angrier at the same time. And I think that much of what we are seeing is it is the first time in humanity's collective experience where more people believe that they have a voice, that voice should be heard, that they have needs, and those needs should be met, which is very different than the apathy or fatalism of much of human history, where people basically were born into a circumstance, and felt that they had to just, this is how they were born, this is the world as it was, deal with it. I think that's an incredibly positive thing in general, but in the short term, it's an incredibly unknown, scary thing that has lots of different iterations. We were talking about China. China's a very controlled society, but if you look at online life in China, even though everyone knows you cannot criticize the government, the arguments and the debates and the roiling, that was never true in China, and is true now more than ever online. So I don't think nationalism and these governments are going to succeed in squashing that human desire for having their voices heard and their needs met. I don't know what the political systems are going to be, but I believe that that is an inherently positive thing, not a negative thing.
Thank you.
Hello.
Please.
Good evening. My name is Feji Kazovic, and I really enjoyed your presentation and the way you set up the table to have a positive view over Europe. So I've been in renewable energy for the last decade, and I have watched the, let's say, disruption of different industries. And when we are talking about, for example, the factories of cars in Europe, and we're talking about, for example, the technological advances in China, they are so different. I mean, a factory in Beijing produces a chassis in 76 seconds using 700 robots that are synchronized in such a way that the entire factory is only managed by 20 human beings.
Yeah.
So that means that if we are talking about the future of, let's say, the auto industry in Europe, we are going to see basically a lot of layoffs. Hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose their jobs because they're redundant. Because I think the more labor-intensive part of that is creating robots, not creating cars. Because at the end of the day, the cars are created by robots, not by human beings.
So what's the question?
Well, the question is, how do you see this, let's say, renewal of the new workforce of Europe?
So again, this has been happening decade after decade after decade, right? In the United States, 2 million farmers grow more food than 50 million farmers grew in 1900. Same trend in Europe, same trend everywhere. There's been fewer and fewer people employed in manufacturing in Europe, in the United States, decade by decade by decade. You're right that China is the next, the robotization of these factories is the next stage, but a lot of people started losing jobs as factories became just-in-time manufacturing and more effective manufacturing floors in the 80s, in the 90s, in the aughts, in the 2010s. And so two things are going on. First of all, there are going to be fewer and fewer people to have those jobs because birth rates in the developed world are, aggregate birth rates in the EU as a whole are probably around 1.5, maybe a little bit lower, and going down, not going up. So there's going to be fewer people to be employed. You're going to need those robots. The challenge is, what do you do about the people who are disrupted in the interim? You either pay social safety nets or you don't, but that's going to happen anyway. And then what you never do know is, what are the jobs that are going to get created? So we're very aware of the jobs that get lost. We're not as aware as the jobs that get created. And there too, I can't tell you exactly what jobs are going to get created by robotization and AI combined, but it is clear from every other technological revolution that out of that disruption comes some sort of creation. It's the problem of what happens in real time in the middle, and that can create political crises, and that can do all sorts of things. But it is also clear it's not like people. The onward march of technology for the past century has led to greater material well-being, not lesser, even as it has eliminated a lot of jobs. It just is very disruptive in the interim. And look, it's easier for me to say that. I don't have to run for office. I don't have to look people in the eye and say, don't worry, you'll be fine. That's not a satisfying answer to a human being who has lost a job. So I'm not pretending that these are easy equations.
Great.
I'm really honored to be able to listen to your presentation, and I think it's been very indulge a lot of dialogue and conversations. My question is related to European Union. Particularly, ever since the European Union was formed, there were many conversations about whether it goes forward with federalization or confederation.
Confederation.
And the rearmament you spoke about in your discussion, how would that play a role, whether European Union would be more turned towards federalization or confederacy? That is my question. How would that rearmament play into what future European Union would be?
So like the best case scenario, if you're going to rearm and you're the European Union, would be to do it cohesively and to decide, the Germans are going to make tanks and French are going to make planes, and we're all going to share each other's equipment and knowledge and have unified command structures and actual interoperative supply chains. That's what would make sense. But even there, where it makes sense, you run up against national, I don't want to just let the Germans make my tanks. I want to make my own tanks. And, I don't want to have them make my planes. I want to make my own planes. And I think what's indicative is, look, the reality is, even if there's going to be a little more political unity, I still think you're just going to see this federation structure whereby even when 27 nations agree, they then do what they want anyway, right? So they all agree, we're all going to do the same thing, and then they don't do the same thing. And that's happened with budget targets, it's happened with defense targets, it's happened with regulatory patterns. So, Brussels says, everybody do this. And everybody says, yes. We're all going to do this. And then the French go, yeah, we're not going to do that. And the Germans go, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. And the Bulgarians go, we weren't going to do that anyway. We just voted for it. So
Bulgarians say that they will do it and then they don't.
Right. Yeah. And there's no enforcement mechanism, right? You don't do it and everyone goes, well, you should have. And I think that for now is just the future, is that it's not going to break apart. It's going to chronically talk about how it should be more together. And it's going to just muddle through the way it's been for the next, 5 to 10 years. Beyond that, I have no idea.
Thank you so much.
One last question, if there is one last. Please.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for sharing your perspective on this important topic. My name is Novak Đurić, and I would really like to ask you, what's your perspective on the future of monetary system, or what could go right, to say it like that, with the monetary system, with a short context? Last week, silver hit all-time high, I believe, $47 per ounce is current situation, and the gold is rising to almost $4,000 per ounce. So, the good, as Robert Kiyosaki would form it, the God's money is going up, and there is a say, when the fiat money is on the power, the real money is hiding, and it doesn't hide anymore. So, with that perspective, what is the global economy telling us, and especially in the euro, because as Mr. Jeremic said, and you as well, we are witnessing the war budgets in Europe and in Russia, and that has an enormous effect. And also, he mentioned the crypto moment. So that's my question. So what is your perspective?
The future of the global monetary system, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So I think the dollar will, there will be more alternatives to the dollar, but there will not be enough alternatives to the dollar. And I think what you're seeing with gold and with silver, and to some degree with Bitcoin, is that there's just a lot of money in the world, because there's a lot of wealth creation in the world, whether it's in Saudi or the Gulf or the EU or China, and there's not enough places for that money to go. And so it's going into anywhere it can go, because it's not just gold and silver, it's global real estate prices, it's global equities, it's private credit. I don't think you're going to get a tighter monetary union in the Eurozone. You might get a more effective ECB, and you already are seeing a more effective ECB. I mean, the reforms that Draghi put into place after the financial crisis, but I don't think it will be tighter. And I don't think you're going to have an end to the fiat currency system. And the reality is, less trade might be settled in dollars, but U.S. financial markets remain the place people invest, because it's one of the only places where you can absorb enough liquidity and have enough transparency to get your money out. So it's like, even if you hate the United States, it remains the most attractive place to place your capital relative to any other place that you can place your capital. And even if it's not the most attractive, once you've placed all your capital in the place that you have, and you have all this excess capital, there's nowhere else to put it except into gold, or maybe silver, or maybe Bitcoin, or maybe the NASDAQ. And I don't see that changing because there's nothing on the horizon right now that could change it. And I don't see it collapsing. And by collapsing, I don't mean that there won't be a crisis. There's always a possible crisis. Something goes down 20%, the tariffs come on, the markets collapse. That's always possible. But I don't think there's much of an alternative. And that also means we have been living in a remarkably economically stable world. Like, you would have thought the global financial crisis would have toppled governments, led to huge unrest. And while it was a really bad 2 years for Europe, unequivocally, it wasn't nearly as bad as people thought it was going to be at the time. I think that's fair,
Sure.
right? And I think that is indicative of, we live in actually a very stable economic moment globally, remarkably stable, which is why we can argue about tariffs that don't even quite exist.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I hope you found it interesting. I did promise to a number of people that they're going to hear something very new, something really refreshing. I am definitely very happy that we had this conversation. And you should also be happy that now it's the drinks time and the cocktail time. So everybody's invited for drinks. And thank you, Zach,
Thank you
for
all.
your
Thank you
thoughts.
very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.